Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we're going to go through a game between Stockfish and Stoofvlees, played in the TCEC Season 19 Division Premier. This was played a few days ago with Stockfish playing with the white pieces and Stoofvlees playing black. And this was actually quite an interesting and entertaining game where Stoofvlees actually sacrificed their queen. So I'll go through it. So the opening moves were as follows. It was d4, knight to f6, there was knight to f3, e6, and then c4, b6, g3 with bishop to b4 with check, bishop to d2, the bishop retreated backwards, there was knight c3, bishop b7, bishop g2, both sides fianchettoing, followed by both sides castling, and black now playing knight a6, and this was the end of the book moves, and from here on in both the engines are now playing. Stockfish's first move then was rook to c1, gaining the half-open c-file. d5 was played and an exchange on d5 with pawns, and now bishop to f4. And I think white's plan is to play knight to b5 in this position, where white can now hit the c7 pawn with 3 pieces. Black played h6. Now I looked at knight b5 here straight away, I thought this looked quite good. However, black can just play c6 this moment. That knight on a6 actually does quite a good job of defending the c7 square. Instead then, Stockfish just reinforced the c-file with the queen, played queen to c2, and Stoofvlees played queen to d7, connecting the two rooks in the back rank. So black's pretty much fully developed here, and Stockfish now goes in for the attack in the centre with knight to e5, hits black's developed queen, which they put on the e6 square. So the queen's actually quite nicely placed there. There's no problems with it. And Stockfish just retreated backwards, knight to d3. I guess this might stop the knights for black jumping into b4. So it's quite a nice square. And also the queen and knight do a great job of defending the e2 square. But in this position, Stoofvlees now played g5. So hitting the bishop on f4, forcing it backwards. Bishop e3 was played. Maybe bishop d2 was a bit risky because I guess if you play bishop d2 in this position, it sort of blocks the queen from defending this e2 pawn. So bishop to e3 was played by Stockfish. Now usually in these sort of positions, black may be able to play a move like maybe knight to g4. So maybe black could have played this. It's unclear though what happens after bishop to h3. Maybe black can simply take this, I'm not quite sure. Maybe black can take and followed by bishop takes queen, knight takes queen, and maybe even bishop takes, and rook takes knight. So what's happening here? Well, it looks as though actually white's just lost a piece, but actually has a few more extra pawns, maybe one more extra pawn. So yeah, that was quite nasty for white. So maybe black should have played knight to g4 here then. This looks quite like a good move for black. Maybe what white should do now is just play bishop to d2. And black can play moves like c5 though. I think black's doing quite well, so I'm actually really surprised why Stoofvlees didn't play knight g4 in this position. Instead though, after bishop to e3, rook a c8 was played, preparing to push the c pawn. Knight to e5 is played by Stockfish. Knight to b4 was played, attacking the queen on c2, which retreats to b3. And now black does indeed play this c5 move, maybe preparing to take on d4 at some point, or even play c4. As we say though, it's always good just to keep the tension in the centre, and this is kind of what black does. Now Stockfish plays an interesting move, reinforces their knights on e5 with f4. So obviously maybe black at some point could take this d pawn, so it makes sense that Stockfish supports his knights with the f pawn. So there's a trade on f4. Stockfish recaptures with the pawn, again just to reinforce their knight, and black plays queen to f5. Now it's really hard for me to decipher what black's plan in this position, but Stockfish seems to go in for the kill straight away here. Plays rook to f3, prepares a rook lift, preparing rook g3 or rook h3 to attack black's king. So black hides their king on h7, but now white can play this move, bishop h3, attacks the queen, and the queen is also pinned against the rook on c8. Black was forced to move the queen to h5. Now looked at bishop takes c8 here, and if this happened, Black may be able to stay in the game with rook g8 check, king h1 and take with the bishop, and after rook to g1 there's an exchange, and black could play knight to g4, attacking h2 with the queen. So if white takes this off and the bishop recaptures, rook g3, bishop takes e2, another exchange, and this is the position we end up with black having the knight and the pawn for the rook on g3. So white's probably still winning this position, but black's kind of still in the game. They've got some chances. So I think after this queen h5 move, this is the reason Stockfish didn't take the rook on c8. He probably felt it wasn't worth it. Instead they played king h1. The bishop is still attacking the rook, so Stoofvlees moved their rook to e8. And now there's a3 attacking the knights on b4, which gets retreated back to c6. And Stockfish just checks the king. Queen c2, check. The king goes back to h8. And now bishop g2 is played. I think Stockfish is threatening to play rook to h3 and start harassing this queen and this pawn. So already I think actually Stockfish seems to be winning this position. Stoofvlees in this position then played knight takes e5. This makes a lot of sense because it gets rid of white's best piece. But now we get into the exciting part of the game. First off though, if white takes on e5 with f takes, I think black gains a good position with knight g4, threatening mate on h2. After rook to h3, black can bail here with knight takes e3, rook takes h5, and then knight takes c2. And we get into quite an interesting position after rook takes h6. Now this is quite a computer variation. Because if king g7, after rook h5, if black tries to save the knight with knight takes d4, rook g1 is really good because there's no way to stop the discovered check. So actually knight to e3 is given as the best move. After rook g1, f5 to give the king a safety square. White can win the piece back with bishop takes d5, discovered check, knight to g4 and bishop takes b7, and we end up in a quite complicated position like this, reaching an endgame. So that's what happens if Stockfish took on e5, but he didn't. He played rook h3, attacking the queen on h5. And this is why it gets interesting, because Stoofvlees now just sacrifices their queen. Plays queen takes rook, the bishop takes, and knight to g4 is played. So basically, black's just won a knight and a rook in exchange for the queen. And I think, though, this benefits white massively. The queen is just such a powerful piece. Particularly in this position, there's still a lot of pieces remaining. So bishop g1 was played by Stockfish. Black tried to get an open file on the g file. But now queen a4, harassing the a7 pawn, forces black to play a6. And bishop g2. This stops any discovered attacks against white's king on this diagonal. So bishop g2 is a really nice move, just stops and blunts this b7 bishop. Play continued on then with b5, hitting the queen, which goes to c2, and there's b4 hitting the knight on c3. The knight moves to a4, and now this c5 pawn is undermined by this queen and knight, so forces black to push it up. But now white just kicks everything away, plays h3, which hits the knight on g4, and suddenly this knight actually has no squares to go to. So this looks like a whoopsie from black because they've lost more material here. Bishop c8 was played in the game, Stockfish just took on g4, and now we see that actually black's really losing this position because both sides have 3 minor pieces, a rook each, but white has an extra queen. A queen for the rook. So bishop d6 was played, and now just e3, securing everything. It was rook takes g4, bishop to f2 stops rook h4 check, and black actually just sacrifices their rook with rook takes g2. This is desperation. King takes, rook g8, the king went backwards to h1, b3 hits the queen, which goes to d2. There was knight to e4, so it looks as though black still has some chances, but Stockfish is a great defensive engine, just plays queen e1. There was bishop f5, bishop h4, rook to g4, and a really nice move by Stockfish, just played bishop to d8. This bishop can just hang around, stopping any checks. And after king to g7, There was queen a5, harassing more pawns, this pawn and this pawn. Knight g3 check, king h2. This looks quite scary for white, but actually white's king is very safe. After h5, just rook to g1. And it seems like black has just given up here, because after c3, white just wins a free pawn. Black plays h4. There's knight takes d5, bishop to e4. And after a few more moves, knight to f6 is very nice, hits the rook. There was knight to f1 with check. Stockfish takes. After a few more moves, this is where black resigned the game, because simply here, Stockfish can just take on h4 and that'll be game over. There's simply no way that black's going to get back into this game from this position. So a nice game. There were a few interesting ideas here. I think overall though Stockfish was just too strong in this game particularly. Perhaps black should have just played knight to g4 here. I think this is a nice move, and it's typically what you'd see in most games. It makes a lot of logical sense. I don't think that's where black lost it though, but it seemed very dubious to sack the queen in that weird position that we saw right here. Bit weird. Eventually black just seems to didn't have enough material to win the game. Anyway, hope you enjoyed my quick analysis of this game. Hopefully I'll see you in another video very soon. Thank you all for watching.